All right, guys, we're going to talk about the acts of Congress that essentially made Kansas go from a territory into an actual state. So the activities we're going to do for this is I'm going to ask you guys to use a sheet of paper and make this chart. And you're going to fill this chart in as I go through and lecture on the three acts of Congress that are before you. The first would be the Missouri Compromise. I want you to tell me what year what happened. Why was the Missouri Compromise needed? Uh, for what reason was it even discussed? And then, secondly, like what did it do? What did the Missouri Compromise in the end accomplish? Next would be the Compromise of 1850. The same three questions for there, and then finally the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as discussed using your text from pages 68 through page 72. And so make this chart, press pause, and then we're going to start as soon as we get to in, and we're going to start it on the Missouri Compromise. Okay, the Missouri Compromise line is labeled right there. This happened back in 1820. The slave states and territories open to slavery were essentially labeled as the southern states, states in the South. Those states are listed in the aqua color, and then the free states or territories are located right above. The United States had this problem in the fact that they had to expand. And because they had to expand, they understood that they were going to have to address this issue of slavery because the slave states did not want the United States Congress to take over with a whole bunch of free states, and then there'd be only a few slave states remaining, and then those slave states get outnumbered on every vote when it came to something at the national level. So the whole idea was, at this time in 1820, which is when the Missouri Compromise came about, there were a total of 22 states. 11 were free, and 11 were slave states. The Missouri Compromise essentially allowed two additional states to enter into the Union. The first one was Maine, which goes into the upper northeastern corner of the United States, and the second one was Missouri, and Missouri would be listed as a slave state. Any state below that Missouri Compromise line is listed there at 36 degrees and 30 minutes. Any state located below that or territory below that that comes in would be considered a slave state. Anything above that would be considered a free state. The little hook in the bottom right-hand corner of Missouri, this area right here, is what signaled that that would make Missouri a slave state. This therefore kept the balance of power in the Congress and essentially led the way for those rules to be established for future states coming into the Union as they moved west. And that would include right here, Kansas technically would be above this line. Okay? All right, next comes on to the Compromise of 1850. The year is obvious of when this happened, 1850. But the Missouri Compromise didn't really just answer all of the issues at hand. Some of the southern states weren't happy. They didn't like that that slavery was banned in such a humongous area, as indicated by all of this area up here, unorganized territory and lines of an area above this line right here. So they tried and tried and tried, and they tried to come up with this next compromise. So where does Kansas fall in? Well, before Kansas could even become a territory, Congress had to reach a compromise dealing with this slavery issue. California, at the same time, all the way out west, was petitioning to become a state, and because of that, it would put one extra state as a free state, and the slave state would be outnumbered. And this would, again, would be another thing that would anger the southern states. So the Compromise 1850 ended up coming about and was the answer. The compromise said that California would be admitted as a free state, but that this new concept called the Fugitive Slave Act would be adopted. And this Fugitive Slave Act, which is this huge issue, gave the southern states something that they wanted. It said that every citizen was required to assist in recovering any runaway slaves, and fugitive slaves were denied the right to a jury trial. This meant that if a slave escaped from the South to the North had to give the slave back. This, again, made the southern states happy. Therefore, they were okay with the idea California was going to be made into a free state. This next map here shows the two different compromises. First, the Compromise of 1850. This Utah territory became known in it, in this, and then again California, as previously mentioned, out to this area. Kansas Territory is therefore going to be brought up a couple of years later in 1854 through this Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the dividing of this territory ends up becoming a very huge issue. First thing that you need to understand in the Kansas-Nebraska Act is who came up with this idea. There was a pretty influential senator by the name of Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was a person known as an expansionist. He wanted to believe that the United States could expand its boundaries to include much of the continent. So as they started to expand, they realized this new Louisiana Purchase territory that had been purchased several years back needed to be settled, and it was eventually made into territories and then states. Well, when you're dividing up land, again, we have this issue of slave versus not slave. So Douglas came up with a new idea. He thought that he could gain the South's cooperation, even though there was that line that said that anything above that line would be, which would be indicated right here in this line. Even though this line would say that anything above would have been free, Douglas came up with another idea, and it was called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that people who lived in the territories were given the right to decide, in this case on the issue of slavery. So therefore, people in Kansas territory would vote on whether slavery was allowed there. With the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Congress ended up repealing or taking away the Missouri Compromise. It opened up two new territories for settlement, Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. And they did not want to, those who opposed slavery didn't want to see slavery, and of course all the blue states that were up here did not want to see slavery come into here. So this becomes a very important issue. Who was going to influence this Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory? Who was going to influence it, and where was slavery going to go? Mentioned on page 72 in your text, one extra additional item is Lincoln's speech on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so I would like for you guys, again, try to take a look at that speech. We will be talking about that in just a couple of days, but that is a very important speech, and so it again adds to this idea of this Kansas-Nebraska Act and its power and influence. All right, so bring those sheets, bring that chart from this lecture here, bring that chart into class on Thursday, and we'll get going.